What if I told you there was once a man whose courage was so feared by a king that they designed his death not to kill him quickly, but to erase every shred of his humanity before the end? A man whose defiance rattled thrones and whose name centuries later still chills the air in the halls of power. This is not the William Wallace you think you know from films. This is the Wallace whose final hours became one of the most calculated acts of cruelty in history, and every moment was designed to make Scotland tremble. Hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started with the disturbing truth they never showed you. Meet William Wallace, the rebel knight, the scourge of English armies, the man they would call traitor, murderer, heretic. To England, he was a criminal whose existence embarrassed their rule. To Scotland, he was more than a man, he was an idea, a living reminder that chains could be broken. And that made him far more dangerous than any sword in battle. But here's the thing, Wallace wasn't destroyed by English steel on the battlefield. He wasn't felled in the chaos of war. His end was written in ink, not blood at first. He was captured, not killed outright, because Edward the Firmer Longshanks had something far worse in mind. Wallace's execution would be theater, a performance, and the audience was the entire nation. The year was 1305. London's streets clattered with hooves and rang with merchants' cries, but on this August morning there was a different noise rising the low electric hum of a crowd hungry for a spectacle. Wallace was in chains, dragged from the Tower of London, about to be paraded like a prize animal. The man who had humiliated English heavy cavalry at Stirling Bridge was now a living trophy. Medieval justice wasn't about ending life, it was about demonstrating power. And for traitors, England reserved the most elaborate punishment imaginable: hanging, drawing, and quartering. It was more than execution. It was the systematic dismantling of body and soul. Every stage had meaning. Every cut was a message. Before we step into the scaffold's shadow, you need to understand the world that built it. Scotland, at the turn of the 14th century, was not yet a unified nation, but a patchwork of clans, nobles, and shifting loyalties. Wallace rose from this chaos not as a noble chasing a crown, but as a man with nothing left to lose. The English had taken his family, his land, his peace. They had left him with rage and vision. In 1297 at Stirling Bridge, that vision turned into history. Wallace and his forces destroyed an English army many thought invincible. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a crack in the myth of English supremacy. For a moment, Scotland glimpsed what freedom might look like. For Edward I, that was intolerable. Edward was no stranger to crushing rebellions. He had subdued Wales with an iron fist, expelled the Jews from England, and believed fear was the only reliable tool of governance. Wallace's very survival was an insult proof that English rule could be resisted. That made his capture not just desirable, it was essential. The hunt for Wallace was long and relentless. English gold and promises turned friends into informants. Villages that once sheltered him now shut their doors. In August 1305 near Glasgow, the net finally closed. Betrayal came from Sir John Menteith, a fellow Scot who had bent the knee to Edward. Whether it was for silver survival or something darker, Menteith's name would be forever linked to treachery. From the moment he was taken, Wallace's punishment began. Bound and guarded, he was paraded through English towns on the road to London. At every stop, crowds gathered to jeer, spit, and throw filth. It wasn't random cruelty, it was deliberate. Edward wanted the man's spirit broken long before the rope ever touched his neck. But as the miles passed, Wallace's eyes stayed fixed on some distant point, as if he could already see beyond the scaffold. By the time Wallace reached London, the city was primed for his arrival. Rumors of the Scottish traitor had been stoked for weeks, and Westminster Hall was prepared not for a trial, but for a show. The charges were already written: treason, murder, sacrilege, arson. The irony was bitter. Wallace was accused of betraying a king he had never sworn to serve. The trial was conducted in Latin, a language Wallace likely could not understand. No defense would have mattered. The judges, all chosen by Edward, were there to give a verdict the king had already decided. This was not about justice. It was about erasing any notion that defying England could end in anything but ruin. When Wallace was given the chance to speak, he did not grovel. He stated simply that he could not commit treason against Edward the Hunted because he had never been Edward's subject. Those words were a spark of defiance in a room designed to crush it. They did not save him, but they ensured his legend would carry on. The sentence was ceremonial in its cruelty. Wallace would be drawn through London's busiest streets, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled, alive, beheaded, and quartered. Each stage was drenched in symbolism, the drawing to strip him of dignity, the hanging to deny him God's mercy, the disemboweling to destroy his humanity, and the quartering to obliterate his memory. August 23, 1305. The summer sun rose on a city that buzzed with morbid excitement. Vendors sold food and ale along the execution route. Families came early to claim the best vantage points. Children clung to wooden railings, eager to see the monster their parents spoke of. The air was thick with the mingled sense of roasted meat and anticipation. From the Tower of London, Wallace was stripped of any last shred of knightly dignity. His body was bound to a wooden hurdle, a rough frame dragged behind horses. As the procession began, the iron-shod hooves clattered the ropes bit into his wrists, and the cobblestones tore into his skin. Behind him, a trail of blood marked the slow path toward death. The route was deliberate, winding through London's most crowded districts to ensure the maximum number of onlookers. People jeered, spat, and threw refuse. Some cursed his name, others watched in silence, their faces unreadable. This was psychological warfare, designed not only for Wallace but for everyone who might dare to follow his example. Through it all, witnesses later said Wallace's gaze never faltered. He looked neither left nor right as though the mob were shadows and his mind was elsewhere. Was it resignation, defiance, or the final focus of a man determined not to give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him break? Hours later, the procession reached Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground. Here the crowd was denser, the noise deafening. Wooden scaffolds had been built to give spectators a clear view. Ale mugs clinked, laughter mingled with shouts, and the air reeked of sweat mud and anticipation. This was not grief, it was a carnival of death. The executioner stepped forward, a professional of his grim trade known for prolonging agony with surgical skill. He approached Wallace not as a man, but as a task, an opportunity to display mastery in the craft of slow dying. And with that, the real performance began. First came the hanging. The rope tightened around Wallace's neck, lifting him just enough to choke, but not enough to snap the spine. His body convulsed, his legs kicked against the empty air, and his face flushed a deep, unnatural purple. The crowd roared, not in pity, but in bloodthirsty approval. This was the opening act, and they knew more was coming. Before death could claim him, the executioner cut him down. Wallace collapsed onto the scaffold, gasping for air, the world spinning in a blur of light and shadow. But there was no pause, no mercy. Even as his lungs clawed for breath, gloved hands forced him flat ropes binding him for what would follow. The executioner drew a blade, long, sharp, glinting in the summer sun. With deliberate precision, he sliced open Wallace's abdomen. The wound was not quick nor clean. Warmth flooded the wood beneath him, and the metallic scent of blood mingled with the hot stench of the day. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, part horror, part fascination. One by one, the executioner removed Wallace's organs. Each was held high for the spectators to see, a macabre offering to the gathered masses. Then, with theatrical flair, he tossed them into a fire built nearby. Flames hissed, consuming the flesh, sending up smoke that twisted into the air like the spirit of a man being burned from existence. In medieval belief, the bowels were seen as the seat of emotion and compassion. To burn them in front of the victim was to symbolically destroy the part of him that made him human. This was not only physical torment, it was psychological desecration. Wallace watched as the last vestiges of his humanity were fed to the flames. Some accounts claim that Wallace spoke during this ordeal, though the words are lost to history. Whether they were curses, prayers, or defiant last thoughts, no one could agree. What was certain was that he never begged for his life. The English had stripped him of everything but his dignity, and that he guarded fiercely. The crowd, once raucous, now seemed entranced. They leaned forward, eyes wide, caught between horror and the inability to look away. Children were lifted higher to see. Merchants paused mid-sail. Every heartbeat of Wallace's agony was seared into the city's memory. Finally, the executioner ended the ordeal. With a single stroke of his axe, he severed Wallace's head. Blood sprayed against the wood, a crimson punctuation to the violence that had unfolded. The head was lifted high, the crowd's cheer erupting like a victory cry at the end of a brutal war. But even in death, the humiliation was not over. The body was divided into 4 parts, quarters, displayed to the crowd as though they were cuts of meat in a market. Each limb was destined for a different city: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. Each would stand as a silent, rotting warning. The head was preserved in tar, then mounted on a spike above London Bridge. For years, travelers crossing the Thames would see it, the face weathered by sun and rain, the eyes gone, but the defiance somehow still there. It was England's message to the world: this is the price of rebellion. When the execution was over, the scaffold stood drenched in blood, the wood dark and slick under the late summer sun. Vendors began packing their stalls. Spectators drifted away in small clusters, talking not in whispers, but in excited bursts, replaying their favorite moments of the spectacle. Some spoke of the hanging, others of the fire that devoured his entrails. For them, it was entertainment. For the Scottish, it was a wound that would not heal. In Newcastle, Wallace's quarter was nailed to the city gates. Rain soaked the flesh until it swelled. The wind rattled the wooden beams to which it was fixed. Travelers approaching the city would see at first a pale, shriveled piece of what had once been a man dangling as a warning. In Berwick, the same grim display greeted merchants and farmers returning from market. It was England's way of planting fear like a flag. Stirling was perhaps the cruelest choice. It was there that Wallace had humiliated the English in 1297, shattering their heavy cavalry. Now his flesh returned not in triumph, but in defeat, a grotesque inversion of his greatest victory. People who had once cheered his name now passed the gate in silence, each forced to look up at the grisly trophy before being allowed inside. In Perth, the quartered limb stood as both a relic and a threat. Some Scots averted their eyes, others stared too long as if memorizing it. Whispers ran through the streets about the betrayal, about the trial, about the way he had met death without screaming. The English believed they had extinguished the ember of rebellion, but under the surface those whispers were fanning it back to life. The tarred head on London Bridge became a landmark. Children pointed at it from boats on the Thames. Foreign merchants arriving in the city would ask whose head it was, and the answer, "William Wallace, traitor," would be repeated like a rehearsed line. Yet some who heard it would go home and tell a different story, one of a man who stood against a king and paid the ultimate price. Edward the Fair Longshanks considered it a flawless victory. The rebel was dead, the message was clear, and the nobles of Scotland were more compliant than ever. But Edward had misunderstood something fundamental. Cruelty is a double-edged sword. It can frighten, but it can also inspire. In Wallace's death, many saw not the futility of resistance, but its necessity. News of the execution traveled quickly beyond England and Scotland. In the courts of France, whispers painted Edward not as a strong ruler, but as a tyrant who turned justice into a spectacle. In Flanders, merchants spoke of the cruelty at Smithfield with unease. Even in Rome, the story reached ears accustomed to the intrigues of kings and popes, and it left an impression that would linger. For Robert the Bruce, the execution was a turning point. He had once bent the knee to Edward, calculating that survival required compromise. But seeing what had been done to Wallace and hearing how Wallace had faced it stirred something deeper. The brutality stripped away the illusion that peace could be bought through submission. The war for Scotland's soul was far from over. Among ordinary Scots, Wallace's death became a legend almost overnight. Ballads were composed, some in secret, recounting not just his victories, but his defiance at the gallows. Mothers told their children stories of the knight who never cried out. Farmers spoke his name in the fields. The English had meant to destroy his memory. Instead, they had engraved it into the bedrock of Scottish identity. Even the manner of his execution, hanging, drawing, and quartering, became part of the myth. In taverns and marketplaces, the tale was told with variations, each storyteller adding flourishes the size of the crowd, the color of the executioner's eyes, the exact words Wallace spoke before the blade fell. Truth and legend braided together until they were inseparable, and perhaps that was fitting. For Wallace had always been more than a man, he was a story, and stories do not die on the scaffold. In the weeks that followed, the physical remnants of Wallace's body began to decay, but the image of his death only grew sharper in the minds of those who had seen it or heard it retold. Londoners spoke of the crowd's frenzy of the moment the executioner held aloft the severed head. In Scotland, those same details were recounted with a different tone, not as a warning, but as a sacred memory of defiance. Merchants crossing the border carried more than goods, they carried the story. Each time it was told, the edges of reality blurred, and the cruelty of Edward's spectacle became more grotesque in the telling. To some, the flames that consumed Wallace's entrails roared higher with each retelling. To others, his eyes never closed even in death, as though they were still watching over his homeland. The psychological wound in Scotland was deep. For many, the sight of his dismembered remains nailed to gates and walls was a humiliation that could not be borne. Farmers in the shadow of those gates would avoid looking up, but at night some would mutter oaths beneath their breath, vows that the blood debt would one day be repaid. Edward's advisors praised the execution as a masterpiece of statecraft. They saw fear in the eyes of Scottish envoys and believed the lesson had been learned. But they mistook silence for submission. In truth, the horror of Wallace's death planted a stubborn seed, a belief that living under English rule was a slower, quieter form of the same torture. Years later, when Robert the Bruce raised his standard against England, veterans of Wallace's campaigns joined without hesitation. Some had seen the gates adorned with their leader's remains. Others had only heard the tales, but that was enough. The brutality of 1305 had ensured that when the chance for rebellion came again, hesitation would not be part of the Scottish temperament. In the halls of Europe, the story acquired another layer. Diplomats began using Wallace's fate as an example of England's ruthlessness. It was whispered in French courts and Italian monasteries, if England could do this to a knight, what might they do to a king's envoy or a rival prince? Edward's message of dominance had been heard, but so had the undertone of cruelty, and it made allies wary. The execution also shifted the way Scots thought about loyalty. Before, Wallace allegiance was often to clan or lord. After Wallace, there was a growing sense of something larger loyalty to Scotland itself. His death acted as a forge, hammering together disparate identities into a shared cause. The English crown had not intended to create a martyr, but in doing so it had given the Scottish people a symbol of unity they had never truly possessed before. The places where his remains were displayed became quiet sites of pilgrimage for some. In Stirling, children were told not to look too long at the grisly relic, yet some did, memorizing the contours of what was left. In Perth, travelers would pause, lower their voices, and then walk on, carrying the image away in silence. These locations, meant to be warnings, became touchstones of remembrance. Even decades later, the story of Wallace's last moments was kept alive by wandering minstrels and poets. They would sing of the man who stood unbroken of the fire that consumed his body, but not his spirit. The details of the execution were retold not to horrify, but to inspire proof that there were causes worth suffering for, even when the suffering was beyond imagination. In this way, Wallace's death achieved what his life could not. He became eternal, a figure who belonged not just to the Scotland of 1305, but to every generation that would one day question the cost of freedom. The scaffold at Smithfield had been intended to erase him. Instead, it had carved his name into history with strokes of blood and fire. In the generations that followed, Wallace's story was passed down like a guarded heirloom, shaped by the teller, but never stripped of its defiance. Grandfathers would speak of him by the fire in winter, their voices low, as though the English crown might still be listening. For the young, these stories were more than history. They were a call to remember that freedom had been bought with a price no one should ever forget. The method of his death, hanging, drawing, and quartering, remained infamous. Even centuries later, historians would remark on the deliberate structure of the punishment. Every step had been calculated to strip away dignity, to turn a man into a public lesson. And yet the lesson had been inverted. The more the English had tried to degrade him, the more noble his memory became. Wallace's trial, recorded in the annals of English law, became a study in the manipulation of justice. The charges were chosen for their theatrical weight, the proceedings designed to legitimize a sentence that had already been decided. To later generations, it stood as an example of how law can be bent into a weapon when wielded by those who fear what a man represents. In Scotland, the image of Wallace at his trial, silent in the face of accusation, unbent by the power arrayed against him, became part of the national imagination. Painters would later depict the scene with Wallace standing tall, even in chains, his eyes steady, while his accusers avoided his gaze. Whether or not the moment had truly happened that way, it became the truth Scotland chose to remember. Edward Thor did not live to see the full consequences of that August day in 1305. By the time of his death in 1307, Scotland was rising again, the fires of rebellion stoked by the memory of the man England had tried to erase. The scaffold had not ended the fight, it had given it a martyr. Beyond Scotland's borders, Wallace's fate began to influence ideas about justice and cruelty. Scholars in later centuries reflecting on medieval punishments would point to his execution as a turning point, a moment when the spectacle of state violence had overreached, creating sympathy for the victim even among those who had once opposed him. The Smithfield scaffold became infamous. Other executions would follow there, but none would carry the same weight, the same mixture of horror and admiration. Visitors to London would sometimes ask to be shown the spot, as if standing on that ground might allow them to feel the echo of what had happened. In the Scottish imagination, Wallace's life and death fused into a single narrative. A man who rose from obscurity, defied the most powerful king in Europe, and met a death meant to destroy him without once bending the knee. This was the Scotland that poets and patriots clung to, not the fractured, cautious realm of politics, but the fearless ideal born on a blood-soaked scaffold. Even the English chroniclers, loyal to Edward, could not avoid acknowledging his composure. Their accounts, intended to cement his guilt, often betrayed an unintended respect. They wrote of how he did not cry out, how he met his end with eyes open. In trying to portray him as a villain, they preserved him as a figure of rare endurance, By the dawn of the modern age, William Wallace had ceased to be just a man. He was a symbol invoked whenever the balance between power and liberty tilted too far toward tyranny. His story was retold in rebellions, quoted in parliaments, and carried in the hearts of those who believed that even the mightiest crown could be challenged by the will of a single, unbroken soul. As centuries passed, the details of Wallace's execution blurred in places, but the emotional weight remained sharp. In every retelling, whether by scholar, poet, or soldier, the essence was the same: a man standing against impossible odds, enduring a death crafted to shatter him, yet somehow leaving the scaffold undefeated in spirit. That paradox, defeat in life, victory in legacy, was what gave the story its staying power. In Scottish villages, his name became a quiet oath. Farmers in the fields, fishermen on the coast, and shepherds in the highlands would speak of Wallace when talk turned to hardship or injustice. He was the reminder that resistance was not futile, that even when crushed one could leave a mark deeper than the sword's cut. The English crown in its archives kept meticulous records of his trial and execution, proof in their eyes of justice served. Yet those same documents centuries later would be read very differently. What had once been intended as an example of royal authority became, in modern interpretation, a case study in state cruelty and overreach. Artists, centuries removed from the blood and smoke of 1305, would paint and carve his likeness. Some showed him on the scaffold chains, clinking head unbowed. Others placed him on the battlefield, sword in hand, a storm breaking behind him. In all these depictions, his figure loomed larger than life, as if death had expanded rather than diminished him. For historians, Wallace's story became a reminder of the fragility of freedom. His execution underscored how swiftly law could be twisted, how easily power could mask vengeance as justice. For ordinary people, the lesson was more visceral: that liberty once lost would always be won back at the highest cost. In the centuries of political struggle that followed, Scottish leaders would invoke Wallace's name to rally support his legend, serving as both shield and sword in the fight for autonomy. Even when the calls for rebellion quieted, his story remained in the marrow of the nation, waiting for the right moment to surface. By the time the modern world emerged, industrial cities, railways, telegraphs, the physical places tied to Wallace's final journey had changed. London Bridge no longer bore his head, the gates that displayed his quarters had rotted away. But the memory clung to those locations like an unseen stain. Tourists walked there unaware, while locals felt the weight in the air. Every generation found its own meaning in the tale. For some, Wallace was a patriot. For others, a martyr of liberty. For a few, simply a man caught in the gears of history. But for all, his story remained proof that a single individual, armed only with conviction, could shake the foundations of power. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: Edward I achieved exactly the opposite of what he intended. He turned a rebel into a legend, a man into a myth that would outlive not only him, but his entire dynasty. The scaffold at Smithfield was meant to silence William Wallace forever. Instead, it made his voice eternal. So, when we speak of freedom today, when we weigh its price and measure its worth, we are still, whether we realize it or not, walking in the shadow of that August morning in 1305. The cobblestones of medieval London may no longer bear his blood, but they still echo with the message, his life and death carved into history, that there are causes worth any price, and that the human spirit, even in the moment of its breaking, can still rise unbowed.